Hi, and welcome to a special edition of our COVID-19 webinar, our COVID-19 response webinar series. This series of webinars is brought to you by the National Tooling and Machining Association and the Precision Metal Forming Association. I'm Caitlin Sickles, and I am joined for today's webinar by my colleague at the Policy Resolution Group at Bracewell, Paul Nathanson. Paul, do you want to say hi?
Hello, Caitlin and everybody.
Hey, I'm sort of doing this intro like our podcast intros, and also by your on-the-ground lobbying team in Washington, D.C., the Franklin Partnership. We have Omar Nashashibi and John Guzik on. Hi, guys.
Hello. Hello.
So I said that today's webinar is a special episode. That is because it is our 20th webinar since we started this series. You can find all of the previous webinar recordings about the COVID-19 response at the legislative and federal regulatory efforts on our onevoiceinfo.org website. Most folks know that website we put up to house these webinar recordings as well as other information about what you need to know about COVID-19 response. So this is our 20th webinar, but it is also the final webinar before the 2020 presidential election. So I know, guys, you have a lot of content prepared. You're probably going to walk through the latest on COVID response, and then, of course, a little bit of politics, which is what everybody wants to hear. And when you want to hear politics, I hope you are also tuning into our podcast. We've got a podcast, Talking with One Voice. It is the voices that you hear on today's webinar, but we're talking about the issues that impact small and medium-sized manufacturers all across the country, and of course, a healthy dose of what we think is going on in the political world. So with that, let me turn it over to the team from Franklin Partnership, talk about the COVID-19 relief legislation status. It's been quite a roller coaster in recent weeks trying to track what's going to happen next. So I'll turn it over to you guys to tell everybody on what they might expect.
Well, thank you, Caitlin. For those of you who've been following this in the news, Speaker Pelosi had indicated that they needed to come to a deal on the stimulus package by Tuesday if it was going to be voted on before the election. Well, just as this slide says, President Trump and Speaker Pelosi haven't spoken in over a year, while the negotiations with Speaker Pelosi and Secretary Mnuchin continue. It's unlikely. This slide of the last 2 weeks is just like a microcosm of the craziness that's going on in Washington. It's like a bunch of whiplash, as we may have talked in the past on just the last 2 weeks. On February 6th at roughly 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the president tweeted out that he was withdrawing from discussions for a next stimulus package. That was like 3 o'clock in the afternoon, just before a meeting that was scheduled for Pelosi and Mnuchin to discuss the next stimulus package. The stock market proceeded to collapse. And then at 10 o'clock that evening, probably after meeting with his economic advisors, the president says, "Oh, I'm not going to withdraw from negotiations. We'll just do separate bills. We'll do one for the travel industry, do something for PPP, and maybe we'll do direct payments." Well, that went over like a lead balloon with Speaker Pelosi. She said she wasn't going to do that. And then a couple of days later, the White House comes back and says, "Okay, just kidding. We'll now up our offer from the 1.6 million, which is proposed by the bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus." The White House offered a $1.8 trillion bill. If you remember, the Senate package is at 2.2 trillion. Speaker Pelosi says, "No, we want a minimum of 2 million. That's when she got in trouble with a couple of her members who said, "Why aren't we compromising and taking the 2 million?" She also got in trouble with Wolf Blitzer there. Then McConnell says, "No, I can't pass a $2 trillion bill, not even $1.8 trillion bill through the Senate." So he said that the Senate was going to take up a $500 billion skinny bill, which they did this past week, which failed to get the necessary votes to pass cloture. It did receive 51 votes, but that wasn't enough to let the bill proceed. Then the president came back and says, "I want an even bigger deal." And many of those vulnerable Senate Republicans who are up for re-election, who might be underwater with their polling information, says, yeah, that sounds like a good deal. Let's do this big deal. McConnell then pushes back. No, we can't do that. In the end, Pelosi and Mnuchin, as I said, are continuing to discuss. Omar and I are not very optimistic that anything, well, we feel pretty confident nothing's going to happen prior to the election. And depending on what the election outcome is, we're sort of hesitant on what either something may happen even in November and December. Because as this slide demonstrates, there's basically 4 different tracks that can go to move a stimulus package. One is if the president wins and the Republicans maintain control of the Senate, we believe that there will be a very vigorous lame duck session of Congress when the Congress comes back in November. Could have a possibility of a stimulus bill by Christmas. The converse of that is Joe Biden wins the White House and the Democrats take control of the United States Senate. There, I think it's going to be a very limited lame duck session. There's basically zero chance a stimulus package gets enacted before Christmas, because President-elect Biden, is going to say, I'm going to wait till I get sworn in on January 20th and put my imprint on what the next stimulus package looked like. Then the 2 in between scenarios, one is when Trump wins the election but loses control of the United States Senate. Under that scenario, remember, Senator Mitch McConnell, the Republican, is still in control of the chamber until January 3rd. And so Leader McConnell may try to push a stimulus package with his imprint with President Trump still there in the lame duck session. Caveat to that, our caution to that is, I'm not sure Pelosi is going to go along with it. Similarly, the scenario where Biden wins and Republicans maintain control of the Senate, I think Pelosi is going to say to President-elect Biden, let's wait till after you're sworn in and put our own imprint on what's happening. But Omar, despite all of the foot dragging that's taking place in Congress, there's a lot of activities continuing to take place at the administrative level.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the art of the filibuster, but let's just quickly, before we leave this slide, give you a little bit more context on what we think is going on right now. Pelosi never really wanted a deal in the last few weeks, and we'll tell you why, and that's largely because the tea leaves are obvious. It would benefit the president if he clearly was able to send out even more checks with his signature on them ahead of the election. So what Pelosi's been doing is trying to, once we got past that Labor Day window where clearly the politics were overtaking the policy, it was more of the time of, okay, we're close, we'll drag our feet. We're now 11 days out. What we believe, based on conversation we had with Stafford last night, is what she's thinking is she tees it up. At this point, there's no possible way you'll get a vote prior to the election, but depending on the president's mood and the outcome, the hope is to actually get a vote right now around November 10th, 11th, or 12th. Initially, the thinking was, let's try to tie it into the government shutdown in December. But the concern is, especially if there's some uncertainty down the line, you're better off just trying to get this thing, clear it off the deck and move forward. So right now, we're hopeful that we are going to try to get this thing done here in the mid-November. If not, we still have the backup going forward. But to John's point, there's still a lot going on behind the scenes with regards to PPP. A couple of updates for you all that are still asking us constantly, what do I do about forgiveness? I'm going to demonstrate a loss in 1 year, and then I'm going to have a profit because of these loans, and another being forgiven. It's going to mess with my year ends. We hear you. We understand. I know it's no solace here, but from a forgiveness standpoint, you are reminded in an FAQ that was recently released, you do still have an opportunity to submit those PPP forgiveness loans forms 10 months later. So you have plenty of time. Your clock doesn't start until you've submitted your forgiveness loan application. You've got 10 months to do that within the completion of that covered period. And then even after that, then they've got to remit SBA the forgiveness to you all, to the lender rather. And that's really when the payment term starts. So we understand you need to get it off the books. Just SBA is trying to clarify for folks that you're in an okay situation and you've got a little time here. Similar, this doesn't affect many of our members based on our survey results, but we just wanted to put this slide in. And the next one, just so you're all aware that a couple of weeks ago, the SBA did make an announcement with regards to 50,000 or less PPP loans. They're not allowing straight, no questions asked forgiveness. You'll still have to submit some documentation, submit a certification. And as you can see, there's a little over 3.5 million PPP loans that are under 50,000 or less. But the vast majority of ours that we've seen in our NAICS are usually in the 150 to 300 range and up to around 1 or 2 million. So they'll still have to do some certifications. The only reason we want to mention it here before we jump into politics on the next slide is the way that SBA did this with the 50,000 is by de minimis. They effectively said that the 50,000, even though it's 3.57 million loans out there, is really a de minimis amount of the overall PPP loans. Therefore, just allowing this simplified process, which virtually just automatically forgives it for 50,000 or less, won't have much of an impact. However, the reasoning behind our concern is we don't think this allows for them to go forward with 150,000 or more, or under rather, and allow automatic or similar forgiveness terms as they do here. So if they're claiming they have the authority to do it de minimis at 50, that tells us if you're in the 150,000 or less range and you're hoping for a simplified process, you'd likely have to look to Congress. But for that, we'd have to go back to the politics, John, right? And maybe before we get going, do you want to give us a little preview? What do you think is going to happen with job training, Biden v. Trump? What are the big changes looking forward?
Yeah, the next few slides, we're going to talk about some issue and the differences between what would a Trump administration and a Biden administration look like. These are slides that you could print off and maybe put in your break room and let your employees see the differences leading up to the election. And so we're not going to go through every single line here, but for example, let's look at the National Apprenticeship Act. Under a Trump administration, he's continuing to battle to try to get the National Apprenticeship Act approved by the Congress, but the sticking point is IRAPs. And so, if the Democrats pick up more seats in the House of Representatives, I think the likelihood of getting the IRAPs approved as part of the Apprenticeship Act is a little difficult. However, if under a Biden presidency, I do see the Apprenticeship Act without IRAPs being approved probably through, probably sometime in 2020. But I do want to go back one minute for what Omar was saying about the forgiveness. And, we are continuing to do our virtual meetings with members of Congress. And we had one yesterday with Congressman Fred Upton of Michigan. And he has actually introduced a bill calling for the forgiveness of under 150,000. And he told us he's a vice chair of the Problem Solvers Caucus, and he's pushing hard to get any next stimulus package, legislative language that would allow forgiveness under 150,000.
Yeah, we like to caution folks on those kinds of proposals since there's quite a few out there, but that one we've heard specifically is going to run into continued opposition due to the continued fraud that you're seeing in these low dollar amounts. So again, we wouldn't ask council folks to hold out your hope that if you're under 150,000, you'll have anything forgiven automatically. There will still be paperwork requirements just as under the 50,000. But Paul, just to keep us on schedule, do you want to just give us a little overview of what your sense is of what you're hearing? I know your shop's got quite a bit on environmental regulations, energy policy.
Yeah, thanks, Omar. So, I think where one of the big areas of difference among many between a second Trump administration and a Biden administration is approach to energy and environment. You heard a little bit in the discussion about renewable energy and the oil industry last night in the debate. And this plays out really in the regulatory process and in the judicial process because many, as many of you might know, EPA rulemaking always winds up in the courts, and you could expect that to continue to happen. A couple of the highlights here, under the Trump administration, they instituted this expedited environmental review process for infrastructure projects under NEPA, which these projects were, because of NEPA, were taking a long time, and they have been working on expediting that. You would expect that to continue. It would be rolled back a great deal, which is progressive priority under the Biden administration. This cost-benefit analysis, you might recall that this was a big issue under the Obama administration, and what really upset many in the industry. But you will likely see it come back, include the social costs of carbon in when they're doing rulemaking. It's very controversial in the energy and environment space. The Trump administration has really limited that. Obviously, you would expect that to continue under a second Trump administration. Power plant regulations, which was went up all the way to the Supreme Court, is another really big difference between the administrations. There are also, I wanted to mention some administrative actions that you could expect if there is a Biden administration. Some were mentioned last night: re-entering the Paris Climate Agreement, methane limits, enhanced environmental enforcement. So there are a number of administrative actions that the Biden administration could do, kind of opposite of what the Trump administration has done from an administrative point of view. So this would be a pretty significant change. And we have to mention last night the discussion about the oil industry and the Vice President Biden's comment that Trump kind of pressed him into it in the last 5 minutes of the debate about, you want to end the oil industry. He said, we need the oil industry to transition to renewables. This is a big issue for progressives. And, obviously the Trump administration knows it plays well in Pennsylvania and Texas and Oklahoma, as the president mentioned. So you continue to see in the next 11 days that the Trump administration will focus on that.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and with you transitioning here onto continuing with the regulatory theme, and John and I will go back and forth here in a second on some taxes. But human resources policy, this is something we definitely suggest people to watch. John and I were just speaking with another group this morning about the new normal of government and our real concern here about OSHA and record keeping in light of COVID moving forward. We think the record keeping criteria is really going to trip up a lot of shops here in the next year and a half, where you demonstrate the proper training when you put up posters, how you handled certain incidents and recordables. So these are things that we're really watching. But just quickly here, specifically the NTMA and PMA started working with the NAM in 2018 on how to reform and update the Family Medical Leave Act. This is obviously well before the current pandemic that expects us to probably see some of those criteria and requirements expand. But one thing that we did file comment on in September was how to make it a little bit more or simplify it for the smaller businesses that are maybe 50 to 250 employees that don't have that robust HR shop that deal with intermittent leave. So, but even regardless of who's elected, we are probably expecting some kind of FMLA expansion, potentially even based on what we're seeing under the FFCRA provisions that are already there. And then obviously under OSHA inspections, there's no question that in some shape or form, those are continuing to escalate. And regardless of the administration, we probably see that. But for the most part, we definitely will expect to see additional emphasis from the Biden administration if he would be elected in the space of OSHA. Whereas if it's Trump re-elected in that case, then we'll probably see a little bit more of a business-friendly environment. But speaking of business, John, somebody's going to have to pay for all these deficits and all this coronavirus spending that's going on. Who's going to pay?
Yeah, I think we believe, regardless of who wins the election, taxes are going up. We've added $3.15 trillion to our debt in the last 6 months. So, I think the timing of when Trump, announces some sort of, addressing the revenue issue is a little uncertain. But we do believe President-elect Biden wants to go big. If you remember when Barack Obama came into office, he had a $980 billion stimulus package, which was highly controversial. So Biden wants it big. We are now not talking in billion-dollar packages, we're talking trillion-dollar packages. And so I think we're looking at that. And so Biden could use this stimulus package that once he's elected, to be somewhat paid for. And we probably won't pay for all of it, but we'll use this opportunity to raise additional revenues for the federal government that he's been campaigning on for so long. I mean, for example, he's, on his website, he wants to increase the corporate tax rate to 28%. We don't believe it'll be at that rate. It'll probably be at the OECD level, somewhere 24-25% tax rate, but know that likely is coming under a Biden administration. Also, he wants to raise taxes on those making over $400,000. That means the pass-through rate for those high earners likely goes up to 39.6. And so just be prepared for that. I think Trump, on the other hand, probably is going to be gun shy about increasing tax rates, but he may increase the size of the bracket specifically for the high earners. So I think that's how he addresses some of the budget deficit issues in providing additional revenue going into the Treasury. Credits and deductions are an area both candidates are looking at. Trump is looking at eliminating more credits and deductions. They did this pretty successfully in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, but as Omar and I were talking, each tax credit and deduction has a constituency in Washington, D.C., and it's really hard to eliminate credits and deductions. But I think that will be a backdoor way of Trump trying to raise additional revenue, while Biden probably won't try eliminating. He will probably limit the availability of credits and deductions to those high earners moving forward. And then, as we've talked about in the past, there may be some changes to estate tax, Social Security earnings limit, net operating loss. We see Trump pursuing, more user fees and excise taxes, all additional ways to raise additional income for the Treasury.
Yeah, and we don't want to get into politics and say just because a Democrat's coming in, they're going to increase taxes. That's just not really the way things work in real life, despite that's what the media spins it. Same thing, if it's a Republican president, just don't assume that he's going to be able to cut your taxes. It's going to involve Congress, no matter what. And so as we get to the Senate and who's in control, it's going to be very important because people will promise you all kinds of things on the campaign trail that they know well that they cannot deliver. In this case, when we look at taxes, you're going to have to understand a couple of scenarios. The taxes that cannot be waived or increased. Obviously, the president tried to tell folks that he was getting rid of the payroll tax, but obviously he wasn't because he doesn't have the permission to do that by the Constitution. No matter whether it's Biden or Trump, there's going to be guardrails for them that the Congress is going to have to be involved in some of these decisions. Now, the question is how? Do you go through the reconciliation process that only requires 51 votes? That's how you got Obamacare. That's how you got the Republican Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Or do you try to work with Republicans? In that case, then it's going to be difficult to get some of those tax increases if it's either a Trump or a Biden to the level that they'd like. But regardless, taxes are going to go up. We're also cautioning folks from a planning standpoint. Watch out if you're a business owner, as they're trying to capture those that are not just high earners, but those that are high net wealth. The high net wealth individuals that may own a portion of that business that starts getting counted towards them in some ways, even if they're pass-throughs, we are concerned at other ways to expand that base. There's a real watch out there right now for the businesses that will simply not exist a year from now, many in the service sector, which means the federal, state, and local governments will have a limited base from which they can tap resources, which again means they're going to increase those. So watch out for treating capital gains as ordinary incomes, limiting itemized deductions, insurance. They're taking some of the interest deduction. That's also going to be on the chopping block. So there's quite a few that we're watching. We're already starting to lobby on for both, whether it's Trump or if it's Biden. But take a look on this one. They're a bit more similar than many might think when it comes to China and trade. The way to understand the president's approach when it comes to many of the trade issues is obviously very transactional. And until he gets that transaction that he wants, particularly with China, tariffs are most likely to remain. Our understanding from both talking to Biden people closely, Paul and I have specifically talked to some folks close to the Biden camp on trade, and they've told us that, look, they're going to be in a position to repair and restore. They're not going to go out, try to create new trade agreements. Most likely we're hearing they keep the Chinese tariffs in place. But I don't know, Paul, what do you think on the steel and aluminum? I know you lead a coalition on that. What are your thoughts? Does a Trump continuum, does Biden continue steel and aluminum?
I think the Section 232 steel and aluminum tariffs will be one of the first to be lifted, but I think it will take I don't think it will be on day one. I think from what we're hearing from a Biden administration would first reestablish multilateral relations and come up with a more multilateral strategy to deal with China. But as folks on this call know all too well, the Section 232 tariffs apply to all countries with a couple exceptions on quotas. I do think they will be one of the first lifted on our allies, particularly our close trading partners in Europe, so that they can come up with a common approach to dealing with overcapacity in China.
John, how about copper-based alloys from the EU and Airbus, Boeing?
Yeah, we think the president will continue to threaten to put tariffs on products coming from the EU until Airbus decides to repay the EU for the subsidies that they've received over the past several years. Conversely, we think that Biden will remove the threat of additional tariffs with the EU in the hopes of negotiating a settlement between the EU, the United States, Airbus, and Boeing on that. So we do see a very different policy moving forward on Airbus.
Yeah, we're going to jump here into politics in 1 second, but in 60 seconds or less, just want to give you a quick some of our thoughts on what we're seeing on supply chains. And this administration, the president in particular, has done an excellent job in trying to talk about onshoring and reshoring. And as we've talked about, and as Roger Atkins and others have said, if we are going to have this reshoring, are we going to be prepared? And as PMA and works on its with job training and NTMA and job training, are we going to be prepared for this reshoring or onshoring if and hopefully it does happen? What we are starting to see is certainly from a supply chain standpoint that this administration is continuing to put an emphasis not just on domestic sourcing of critical minerals, but also now starting to work with the allies increasingly to try to make sure that we've got more reliable sources and aren't just looking to China all the time. And if it's a President Biden administration, he probably won't use as much of a stick approach as this administration is with tariffs, to Paul's point, but more likely will continue some tariffs, but also we're hearing they want to push for tax incentives to help businesses try to bring new jobs back to the U.S. that were previously offshored, with also some punishment. So they are definitely hearing the message from us in manufacturing that we have the capacity, we have the ability. We are hopeful, even in the stimulus bill in a couple of weeks, we might get some good reshoring language that we're working on in supply chains. But regardless of the outcome, we're pretty hopeful in that space. But speaking of that, John, let's just get right to it. A pathway to each, road to the White House.
Yes. So how does Donald J. Trump win re-election? Well, as I think we've mentioned in the past, he really needs to maximize the turnout in the rural areas. I hear from many of you and many of my friends who question the polls that are out there and say, well, I've never been called by a pollster. And people in rural areas say the same thing. And so his goal is to maximize the turnout in those rural areas. The one thing the Trump campaign and the Republican Party did well this past year was voter registration. And so they're going to have to gin up those votes for all those people that they've registered over the past year. The registration gap from Democrats to Republicans has dropped. And so Republicans, specifically in states like Pennsylvania, have gained like 185,000 additional votes. Trump, the campaign, is identifying those people and making sure those people turn out. Message discipline is going to be critical in these final 10, 11 days. I think yesterday, the debate, the president showed discipline, but I'm not sure what his message is. And then if I go back a few days earlier, criticizing the most popular physician in the country, Dr. Fauci, in a tweet is probably not proper message discipline in your final weeks of the campaign. He needs to maintain a strong economic message, a message that appeals to people who want to see this economy improve. And so if he continues to maintain some message discipline, I think there's some opportunities there. In addition, the president has done better than a typical Republican in appealing to the African-American vote. In the 16 election, I think Trump got 8% of the African-American vote. Today, he's got high teens, low 20s. That's not a lot, but it's a good step forward, unlike a typical Republican. And then, as many have seen, that the president is struggling with seniors, those over 65. We were on a briefing with a pollster this week, and he talked about the difference in the voters who are 65 and older. Those who move to Arizona and Florida, those folks have the resources and are more concerned about their pocketbook, and they're more concerned about economic issues than the COVID. However, those seniors 65 and over who remain in the Midwest, Michigan through New York, they are more concerned because they're older and susceptible to COVID. So those are the people that the president is struggling to attract. And so I think that's an area where the president is going to have to shore up his vote. And then the last couple of points is the president the Republican Party got killed in the suburbs in 16, especially in the 18 congressional election, and he's going to have to shore up the vote, specifically with women in these suburbs, in those toss-up states. And then he's got to continue the message of banging that Biden is not necessarily crooked, but just back to business as usual in Washington, D.C. So, Omar, how does Joe Biden win?
Well, considering I actually am the one that's been saying Trump's going to win for most of this year, I guess I get stuck with defending, for some reason, the Democrat winning. But, there's a lot of things going on. The way I like to explain this slide is you really need to start at the bottom and then work your way back up, because the president needs this to be a choice election, a choice between law and order, a choice between going back to the greatest economy in the history of mankind to going to socialism and burning in the streets in Portland coming near you. So if it was going to be that choice election, the president would be in a much better position. But as of now, after the guy got COVID, its focus is back on the coronavirus. If you look at the president around the time of the conventions for the GOP, he was doing pretty well. That's around the time that I had my prediction of the podcast right after Labor Day that he would win. It would come down to the disaster that we're all facing in Pennsylvania. But for the most part, you look at Biden, he just has to not make a mistake. He's got 11 days more to go. I think Trump pretty much is keeping the focus on COVID no matter what you do. It had nothing to do with the president himself getting it. It just brought it back into the news again. So we'll see what we look at on turnout. Here's what you're hearing all over, what depends on your news station, no matter what you're seeing it. This was as of 12:17 this morning. You're over 52 million people have already voted. And we'll get to a couple of other turnout slides if you'd like, but generally here's where you stand. There are about 250 or so million Americans, 260 million Americans that are eligible or voting age eligible to vote that are out there. You typically get about 100, let's see, last time you were at 138.4 million people voted in 2016. That was not the record turnout that 2018 was, but it was still a high number. And that number was still at about 61%. Right now, if people are anticipating, and John thinks this is low, maybe it is, but it would obviously be a record. 150 million Americans expected to vote would be 62.4%, also a major record. If you're looking at that 150, you're already a third of the way there with 11 days to go. Now, many will say, well, all these Republicans are holding back and they're going to come out, but it's a census numbers game. You're going to run out of white Trump voters at some point is pretty much the numbers game you're looking at. As we get in there, John, what are your thoughts then on how the map actually sits out and where it looks? Where is it close and how does it look?
I really like this map. But the critical thing to look here, and remember, we elect our presidents by electoral college votes. On this map, and this is basically where Trump was pre-COVID. But I think it's a pretty good map of, if you look at what may happen, coming up this November. But when you look at it, the Democrats have roughly 188 locked in electoral votes of those who are states that are solid and likely Democrat, with only 76 electoral votes on the Republican side. So the Republicans have a lot of work to do. But on this slide, it gives the president 277 electoral votes, which gives them the victory, gives them states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, and then gives them a clean sweep in the Southeast with North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Now, there's we can have a discussion of whether the president's going to get Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. I think more likely it might be Pennsylvania or Wisconsin, but other states that the president probably has a chance in as we look to the election in 11 days is a possibility of picking up Nevada, possibly picking up Arizona. If the president loses Wisconsin, he needs to pick up a state like Arizona to have the necessary electoral votes. But I really do think this is a good gauge of what may happen. It's coming up November. On this slide, it doesn't have it has Biden winning Arizona. That's good. It's a battleground state. The Senate race, which we'll talk about, is clearly looks like the Democrats going to win that. And so I understand why we put that down as Arizona going for Biden, but that'll be critical.
Before we leave that, I'll bring Caitlin in a second as I set up for her to correct me in a minute here. But part of the reason I think that folks are looking at Arizona is the over 65. There's clearly been a focus on women and suburban women, and rightfully so. But at least from my standpoint, I think that women look at voting and election in a much different way. They're not monolithic. They come from different parts of the country, different background, ethnicity, persuasion, and different ages. Whereas the over 65, which are predominantly a large number in Arizona, Florida, Iowa, Pennsylvania, over 65 have one thing in common. They are over 65 years old, and they're more vulnerable, susceptible to COVID. So, that's part of the reason why we go back and forth. Caitlin, I don't know what your thoughts are on suburban women and some of these toss-up states that we've got here going for him or against him.
Sure. As we've started talking about election 2020, even last year, we spent a lot of time talking about the importance of women voters. And we've talked about 2020 being the year of the woman, and that's really for two reasons. We talk about the gender gap, and people think that that's one thing, but it's really two things. It's the fact that more women vote and that women tend to vote Democratic. So with that in mind, it is important for the president to have messaging that appeals to women voters. Now, to your point, Omar, women are not a monolith, right? They have lots of different issues and interests that are important. In fact, oftentimes people will equate softer issues with women, when in fact women voters typically have the same interests that men do: the economy, healthcare, and national security. So with all of that in mind, I think the biggest thing that the president can do to shore up support among women who supported him the previous time is to maintain what John was saying earlier, message discipline. And that is to comport himself in a way that makes women voters who are looking to get to yes, as my colleague Liam Donovan often says, make them feel comfortable that this is an okay choice for them. So when you think about last night's debate, you saw a lot of composure for the president. And I think it's in an effort to attract those people. Now, what will be interesting is to see whether that discipline that carried him through that 90-minute debate can hold when he gets home on the weekend. And we know that he is most active on Twitter on Saturday morning when he wakes up and starts scrolling the news. So we'll see if that discipline can hold. I know that women voters, particularly ones who voted for him last time, are looking to see him comport himself in a way that they can feel comfortable with. And I think that's a test in these final days.
Well, Caitlin, as our Texan, we did have a question here. Do you really believe that Texan is a lean versus likely? And so we have a student audience member here that looks on the right side and sees how there's different color coding. That's the default, frankly, of everybody in Washington. So we did not tweak the Texas to make it a lighter color. Caitlin, what do you think? Do you think we're going to be within 5 points for a Trump win in Texas, or where do you think that's going to end up?
I am a Texan, and I am thrilled to see my home state being one to watch, because Texas doesn't usually make that level of interest in political coverage. Here's an interesting thing. Over 8 million Texans have already voted, which is about turnout level last time. So you see a lot more voters. And that is interesting. Now, typically when people say that if turnout is up, that favors Democrats. So I think that with that number alone in mind, you could see how the race could be closer. I wouldn't say that I'm a state level politics expert, but I think when you look at the role of increased voters, and I think as you consider the changing demographics of the state in terms of nationality and gender and age, there's a lot more young people in Texas, which is wasn't true in recent years. So I think when you consider all of those factors and you consider turnout, it is a possible explanation for why prognosticators are saying that it's closer this year.
Well, John, bring it back to you in Wisconsin. Now we're on the close race scenario here, where you've pretty much we flipped Wisconsin more or less, and then in looking at the TV coverage, they're certainly seeing a spike. We were on a Zoom call with the Democrat from La Crosse area up top in Wisconsin, and yeah, they've got a major surge going on. What do you think on Wisconsin? What's happening there?
If you take out Madison and Milwaukee, Trump is going to have to I talked about earlier, really going to have to run up the vote in those rural areas. I have talked to many manufacturers in Wisconsin. I've talked to many political operatives, many pollsters. I mean, Wisconsin is going to be a critical battle state. I was talking to one, and his thought was the president needs to win Pennsylvania or Michigan or Wisconsin and Nevada. And I think Wisconsin and Nevada is the scenario that I see probably the least likely to get, which is why if you lose Wisconsin, as this map shows, the president doesn't win his reelection. And so that's why for him to win, he either needs to pick up that Nevada, the numbers, Wisconsin and Nevada, or he needs to pick up Arizona out there. But I'm interested in any comments from those on the phone from Wisconsin. I've talked to Jeff Clark and a few others that it is truly a battleground. When you drive out into the rural areas, the number of signs that Trump has is overwhelmingly, but clearly there's strong support in the urban areas. And the one other area, I was talking to a Senate staffer this past week, was really concerned about the low voter turnout on college campuses. Democrats traditionally in the fall do a major voter registration effort on college campuses, and that is what they mobilize in their turnout effort. Well, because a lot of colleges and universities across the country, and I'm not sure what's the situation at the University of Wisconsin, for example, or Marquette, of whether they're in school or not, but they are seeing, while turnout around the country is very high, turnout in the college campus areas is very low, and that's where it may have an impact on a state like Wisconsin, depending on what's happening, you know, in Madison and at Marquette.
Yeah, to your point, John, a Colorado Democrat we were with yesterday said in Colorado they're anticipating the school issue with COVID at universities to cost 3 percentage points, 3 points over there. So that definitely could make a difference. In a normal state, Colorado will be okay, but they are thinking a 3-point drop in some congressional districts. In Wisconsin, this congressman, he's got 6 campuses, the most of any part of Wisconsin. They're still open for the most part, but what they're doing, Democrats in that state and others, because we talked to someone from Washington State, they've got teams that are doing nothing but calling college kids to make sure that they've got their vote in absentee or one way or another. So there is a concerted effort, and I think you bring up an excellent point. But even on this blowout scenario that some talking heads are starting to think about, and some Democrats are starting to measure the drapes, you know, you could even flip Florida down below there, as we've done a number of times, and send it back to Trump, and he would still lose. Now, I personally do believe that Trump will win Florida. I'll finally get an attaboy from Roy Sweatman after many years of him ridiculing our predictions on that state. But we still think he's holding strong with Hispanics. I mean, just remember, he took about 32, 33% of Florida Hispanics last time when W. Bush took the high previously at 28%. But this is where many go. I'm personally just not there yet on Ohio. Was with as you know him, Dave Joyce from Cleveland, Republican from Cleveland, a couple hours ago, and he's still feeling pretty good about those areas. But to John, your point, you know, yard signs, oftentimes the more in places where you see more yard signs, there's typically more of them than people, and
Yeah.
so that's something you gotta watch out for. But I agree, the enthusiasm on the Republican side is still definitely there for the president.
You know, Omar, you and I have talked about, you know, when polls close and when states can start counting their votes, and it's going to vary. It's going to be very difficult because some states can't start counting till after the polls close. Some can start that day. Others, with accepting ballots several days after the election, we may not know who's going to win this election. And in one of the briefings I had with one of the pollsters, he had indicated that we probably won't know the results of the states in the Midwest, like Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, till 2, 3 in the morning. And what he suggested is look at states in the Southeast, in North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, like many pointed out on this slide, that if Trump wins all of those states, it's likely going to be a good day for the president. But if those states are broken up, like demonstrated here on this slide, that it could show a difficult day. So, and those numbers will likely come in probably 11, midnight, 1 o'clock. So that was just a recommendation moving forward. So I thought I want to share it with you all.
So instead of us being totally wrong and giving you our numbers, do rapid fire. Paul, Caitlin, John, is this going to be close or a blowout? You don't have to say which one. Paul, close or blowout?
I think it's going to be not close.
There you go. The non-winner of today's game, Caitlin.
Well, I usually try not to agree with Paul, so in case we're wrong, we're not wrong together. In this case, I do think it will be not close.
All right, Guzik.
I 2 weeks ago would tell you that I thought Trump was going to get blown out. I think today it's tightening. I think it's going to be close.
All right, so let's talk about the U.S. Senate and where we are. And
whoa. How about you, buddy?
Hey. Nice try.
Wait a second.
I tried. I do think it's going to be low 300s. I don't think it'll be the total blowout. It'll probably end up being maybe 2 or 3 states. So I'll put it in the low 312, maybe 311 range for Biden. But definitely 30 days ago, I did not. 30 days ago, I had Trump winning and even getting to 280. But all right, Senate map, as we mentioned, as we're a quarter till. So folks, we're going to run through a couple of Senate slides, a couple of House slides. So any questions that you might want to have, we'll answer them in about 10 minutes or so. Senate races, 53-47 is your current baseline of where we start. Give you a run of the mill before John goes through some states. Here's where you are if you are a Democrat and you want to take over the U.S. Senate from Mitch McConnell. You currently, right now, are up by, let's say, a net 4 because a Pence breaks the tie. So you're a net 4. We're going to assume you're going to lose Alabama if you're a Democrat. So now you need to net 5. If you need to net 5 under a Pence-Trump administration, where do you go? We're going to assume Arizona, Colorado are most likely off the map, many believe. So your net 5 is a net 3 with a Pence and Trump administration. So your net 3, where do you go, John? How do you get there if you're Republicans, if you're a Democrat rather, and Trump wins?
Democrat and Trump wins. I probably would look to Maine, North Carolina, and Iowa as the next round. The problem with Maine, we may not know the election results on Maine because they've got ranked choice voting. So if the person you voted for example, one of the libertarian or third party candidates, if they lose, you vote for your second choice. And so because of the way they count the votes in Maine, it may take a while. So we may not know until well after the election. Similarly, in Georgia, there's 2 Senate races. There's a special election in Georgia for the Senate, and then there's a typical re-election in the race. So there's 2 Senate races in Georgia. Both campaigns may end up in a runoff. That runoff doesn't take place until January 5th. So again, to Omar's point, while they're at a net 3, we may not know until after January, which I think is just going to be a real struggle. But I think the next likely to go would be Maine, North Carolina, Iowa. Keep an eye on Kansas. I am hearing things that the Republican turned Democrat candidate for running for the U.S. Senate in Kansas is gaining ground. I have a hard time believing it. A Democrat hasn't been sworn in as a senator in Kansas in 90 years. But if I read the tea leaves from the political operatives and the political rags, that the Democrats have a chance of picking up that seat in Kansas.
Yeah, Kansas is definitely changing. Don't know if it'll get there that quickly, but there's been some problems with a couple of the candidates. One that was a House member that was defeated in a primary Republican, and then also the general one hasn't been as great in the Senate. My sleeper one to watch is Iowa. I do think Joni Ernst goes down in that race, and that's going to be a net pickup for Democrats there, a combination of just age and a number of over 65. I think that is still a more Republican state, and so I wouldn't imply that Kamala Harris in 2024, whomever the Democrat is, could win it. North Carolina, that one was leaning definitely against the Republican until some recent challenges. And then Montana, I had that one as a Democrat, but they had some COVID numbers spike because of their neighbor, Kristi Noem, and let those bikers come up for a rally in North Dakota. We have 500,000 people now infected, thousands across the country. So Montana's not looking so good for a Democrat in the last week, if you look at it. But before we jump to a couple of key ones here, let's just look at a little scattershot. What this is, like them or hate them, 538, what they do is they enter into a model that they've created and they put variables. They do turnout, African-American turnout, age turnout, more whites, less Democrats, so on and so forth. And then they run these races a number of times. So do we agree with them? Do we give McSally more than a 20% chance, or Gardner? You know, that's neither here nor there, but that guy gets paid a lot of money, so we put his slides up. This is what you see on the left, Arizona. They're saying about a 20% chance the Republican hangs on. My commentary on this, the reason we do believe McSally lost, she lost the first time, folks. She lost the special election to a couple of years ago when she tried to come in there, and she's losing it again here. So, or not the special, but last time the general. So that's part of the reason we think there. Same on Colorado. But John, would love to hear your thoughts on Michigan, since you're from there and things are changing a little bit there. What do you think?
Yeah, I do think things are changing. I still think the president likely loses Michigan, but John James, the Republican candidate there, is going to outperform Trump. And so I think it depends on how much Trump loses Michigan. If Trump loses Michigan by 6 or 8 points, I think it's going to be John James is going to be hard pressed to win this race. But if Trump can close the gap to 2 or 3 points, 2 points or less, I think John James has a shot. But this chart shows, according to the 538 guys, that the Senator Gary Peters has a better than average chance of getting it. And so, if I was a betting man, I'd probably agree with this scenario. But because we're 10 days out, for those on the call from Michigan, we can have another discussion, a few days before the election, because certainly my pick on that Senate race is definitely not locked in yet. So.
Yeah, I do think Susan Collins hangs on in Maine. She's just so well known up there. I don't know if they've tied her enough to Trump. Maybe they have, maybe they haven't. That'll be the sleeper one. Regardless, and this isn't me chickening out, I do think we end up at a 50-50 tie, and whoever's the vice president breaks it. John's correct. You've got some issues in Georgia. Congress gets sworn in 2 days before the Senate race is is held for the follow-up there. But I still think we're going to be extremely close in the Senate. You're going to have to get either bipartisanship or just get rid of the filibuster outright. And John, you used to be over at the NRCC. Can Democrats really net another 5 to 15 seat potentially net seats in the House?
Yeah, I really do. This is turning into an ugly election cycle for House Republicans. Just looking at this map, these are 6 House races these are Republican-leaning seats that are in serious jeopardy. And the key factor of all of these seats is they're largely suburban areas. And so, as we had mentioned in the past, Republicans got hammered in the suburbs. And so, unless Trump proves in the suburbs of St. Louis, Congresswoman Ann Wagner, who's former ambassador, former co-chair of the Republican National Committee, likely goes down. The prognosticators are saying a net gain of 5 to 15 seats for the Democrats in the House. Republicans need 17 to take control. But when you have 26 of your members retire compared to only 9 Democrats, you're already, conceding much of the field. On the toss-up, when you look at the toss-up race, 14 of the toss-up races are held by Republicans and 11 by Democrats. So again, the battleground is going to be in the burbs, and unless Trump's numbers turn dramatically in the next few days, I think it's going to be a challenge to take control of the House of Representatives. So we're looking at probably the final term of Speaker Pelosi as Speaker of the House.
Yeah, we are concerned about some of these allies on here. We've worked very long and strongly with both Wagner and Shabbat, and we are extremely concerned about both those seats. Pence was in Indianapolis and spent the night there. He doesn't actually have a residence there, but he crashed somewhere in Indianapolis the other day and worked on that open Indiana seat. So that tells us they're very concerned over there. The Justin Amash seat, that's in Grand Rapids side of Michigan. That one just got switched over to a toss-up in what shouldn't be a toss-up place. So there definitely are some concerns. Again, you don't have to look at us. This isn't just your team in Washington talking about politics. We look at others. Similar, when you see the birds flying away, you know something's coming. Same thing. You're seeing a lot of these Senate Republicans starting to leave the president. And we're not talking Ben Sasse or Mitt Romney. We're talking the ones that have been with him since they realized it's him. And when you start to see some of them drift away from some of his policies and politics, say, no, I will not go along with the giant COVID bill John was describing. That's some of the tell that we're getting in a few of these states, and also from the confidential conversations that we're having with people up on Capitol Hill. But again, I know we're all tired of politics. We know we're ready for this to all be over. We totally get it. Please ask us any questions. But John, part of it is we do need to continue that fundraising effort, whether to the PAC or to the advocacy, because we're not done with COVID. Unfortunately, we're going to keep on working, and please help us with the fundraising.
And we thank those who've already contributed to PMA's advocacy fund and NTMA's GAF account. And thank you for those contributions. But we need those. If you like what we've been doing with these COVID presentations, while we've said that this would be the final one, this is really the final COVID presentation prior to the election. Depending on what stimulus package gets agreed to, we may, restart. We'll have one more moving forward. So if you like what you're getting, the content, the material, the politics, the substance, the administration rulings and frequently asked questions, we hope you dig deep, make a contribution to either the advocacy or the GAF funds. So thank you very much.
And with that, we're happy to take any questions. As always, in the box over on the right-hand side, please type that in. As always, you can email any of the 4 of us. Please reach out to Bill Padnos, NTMA Nationals, great resource, Christy Carmigiano, PMA National as well, and we can always take care of you. And if not, we'll find an answer if we do not already have one. Please type in your question on the right. We've got one right in front of us here that we'll go ahead and take. First question is, on what date will we know who is the president? So let me, before I turn it over to John for his intel, because he brought up some data points, what we've written up here are the states that when we'll know when they can start to count their votes. This is really important, not when you can cast your ballot, but when they can actually start counting the millions of voters that are coming in. So in Arizona, it can start 2 weeks ahead. So can North Carolina. So that means you'll probably at least not have a major crash at the end of the evening on November 3rd and into the 4th. Florida can start counting 22 days ahead. So that is also helpful there. Ohio can scan ballots, but they can't fully start tallying them. Minnesota can't do anything until after the polls close. Neither can Maine. Looking at Georgia, doesn't start till 7 a.m. that morning, as does Iowa, and Michigan is on election day as well. And Pennsylvania, we're going to make fun of you all for days to come. They don't get started until 7 a.m. and they can keep, it's going to be a mess, folks. The U.S. Supreme Court said Pennsylvania can keep on counting until November 6th. So that if you're a Democrat, you really want a blowout. So that way the thing is decided that evening. But if we don't know what's going on with Florida and some of those, it might go on. But that gives you a rundown of who will know when. In Wisconsin, they start counting after the polls open. So that'll be, Sean's point, another delay. Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin will be delayed. Florida, North Carolina, Arizona should be relatively on time.
My take is it sort of goes back to that blowout close race prediction. I think if it's a blowout, we should know by Thanksgiving who's going to be president, if not sooner. But if it's going to be a close race, I think, Omar, I don't recall, when is the date when the Electoral College needs to meet in December? I think we are really challenging, and the Congress may need to move the date that the Electoral College meets, because they may not have all those ballots counted. You know, in the primary in New York, it took over a month to get in the congressional primary in New York. I think they've worked on fixing those problems. It took a month for the ballots in California to be counted after the last election in 2018. So I do see in some of these states a very long period of time, and if it is a close race, I think, and then you're looking at potential lawsuits moving back and forth, and we're not going to be dealing with hanging chads, but we're going to be dealing with, you know, signatures that don't match up and all. I do see it could be in mid-December when we won't know until mid-December.
Right. So from the statute standpoint, December 8th is what we call the safe harbor, which means if a governor says we've got problems, then that's when they start calling things in and starting to feel out if it's contested. And then they start moving forward with a certificate and how they're going to reconcile that within a few days. December 14th, though, is that real hard date when the electors send their vote or do their votes in the states, and then they've got to deliver them and send them out to DC. So we're pretty much looking at a December 8th. We really need to know where things stand. Those of you that remember Bush v. Gore and those 537 votes, that one was just before Thanksgiving. I thought it was in that range where we really started to see things kick off and then get into early December where we ended up with it. So yes, and then I know someone's going to email us and say, what about the Trump blowout? Yes, there's certainly an opportunity for there to be a Trump blowout. So we said that as well. With that, we still have a couple minutes. We're happy to answer any questions if anyone's had anything else, even going back to PPP and some of the other policy predictions that we had. We're happy to get into that here now or at any other time.
And those who are interested, we are big fans of 270 to Win website. Go on 270 to Win and do your own predictions of how you think each state will fall. And feel free to send it to Omar, Caitlin, Paul, and I, because we'd be interested in what you think, where each state falls.
Yep. Whoever wins, send it to us. The winner will get a free case of Roy Sweatman's wine. There, I committed him.
You guys, I'm doing well on my bets. I had bets on the VP selection. Oh no, wait. I just got cocky there for a second. Then I forgot about how poorly my bet went with how Dr. Fauci's pitch was going to go. So maybe never mind. Don't listen to my bets, people.
I actually do have money where my mouth is on the website Predict It, so I've got to go make some updates on that before the 11th. But you can go in there just like the markets are. You can pretty much do anything with politics, folks. With that, not seeing there's any more questions in the box. As always, thank you for everybody being with us over the 20 some odd presentations we've done. Hope you found them helpful. Please reach out to your association and help do your part as we've done ours. Thank you again for everyone and best wishes.